The Nevada desert is not merely an expanse of sand and rock, it is a repository of silence. For decades, this parched, sun-bleached landscape has held secrets behind invisible lines and barbed-wire fences, secrets that the world was never meant to witness. In the spring of 1989, a narrative began that would puncture this silence forever, emerging from the neon-lit shadows of Las Vegas into the global consciousness. Robert "Bob" Lazar was not a man built for the spotlight. Before he became the most controversial name in the history of aerial anomalies, he was a technician obsessed with the boundaries of the possible. Raised under the humid skies of Florida, Lazar's mind was a labyrinth of circuitry, rocket propellants, and laser optics. He was a self-taught tinkerer, a man who looked at a jet engine and saw a puzzle to be solved. By the time he moved west to the arid plains of Nevada, he was already a ghost in the system. His history at Los Alamos National Laboratory remains a subject of intense debate, a digital erasure or a convenient fabrication, depending on who you ask. Official records are murky, yet his presence was felt in the classified halls of power. It was here in the late 1980s that Lazar received a call that would alter the trajectory of his life. He was invited to a facility known only as S4, located near the legendary Groom Lake, tucked away in the shadows of the Papoose mountain range. The protocol of the void. Entering S4 was not simply a commute. It was a ritual of isolation. Every morning, Lazar boarded a nondescript bus with windows blacked out by heavy paint. He could not see the horizon, nor the direction of travel. He was a passenger in a void, guided only by the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The interior of the bus was a tomb of silence. No one spoke, no one made eye contact. The air carried the faint, sterile scent of ozone and industrial cleaning agents, the olfactory signature of high-security government installations. When the bus finally hissed to a halt and the doors creaked open, Lazar stood before the impossible. Carved directly into the side of the mountain were 9 hangars, disguised with such meticulous care that they appeared as natural folds in the rock. From a distance, even the most sophisticated satellite would see nothing but sun-scorched stone. But as the massive hydraulic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, Lazar stepped out of the known world. Inside the hangars sat 9 crafts of varying designs. Some were sleek and disc-shaped, others were jagged and organic, looking more like something grown than something manufactured. But one particular vehicle stood out, the interior of Hangar S4 was a cathedral of forbidden science. The air here was different, thick with the hum of high-voltage transformers and the metallic tang of ionized air. Standing before the sport model, Lazar felt a profound sense of displacement. This was not a weapon of war or a product of industrial competition. It was an artifact of another reality. When Lazar was finally permitted to approach the craft, his first instinct was that of a technician. He looked for the seams. He looked for the rivets, the bolts, the welds that hold human achievements together, but there were none. The craft appeared as if it had been cast from a single, continuous pour of liquid mercury that had frozen into a state of impossible perfection. It was cold to the touch, yet it possessed a faint, rhythmic vibration, a breath that suggested the machine was not entirely dormant. The architecture of the impossible. Stepping inside the craft was like entering a minimalist nightmare. The dimensions were wrong. The ceiling was low, barely 5 feet high, and the 3 small seats were positioned in a way that suggested the pilots were not built like men. There were no control panels, no bundles of wiring, no flickering monitors. The walls were smooth and curved, sloping into a central pillar that rose from the floor to the ceiling. This was the reactor, the sun that powered the impossible. Lazar's task was to understand the how. He was a reverse engineer in a world where the blueprints didn't exist. He learned that the craft didn't fly, it manipulated the very fabric of the universe. At the base of the central column sat a small, triangular plate containing a heavy, dull-orange substance, element 115. According to the briefings Lazar was forced to memorize, this element was the key. It wasn't just fuel, it was a catalyst. When bombarded with protons in the reactor, element 115 would release an antimatter field, which reacted with a gaseous target to produce a massive amount of energy. But the true miracle was the byproduct, a stable gravity wave. This wave was amplified and directed through 3 gravity amplifiers at the bottom of the craft. By focusing these waves, the ship could fold spacetime toward it, pulling a distant point in the universe to its current location. It didn't move through space, it moved space itself. Lazar realized that if this was true, the distance between stars, trillions of miles of vacuum, meant nothing. The sport model was a needle, and gravity was the thread that could sew the galaxies together. But with this knowledge came a growing, icy dread. Every time Lazar touched the craft, every time he peered into its reactor, he felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. In the corridors of S4, the air was heavy with paranoia. The walls of S4 began to feel less like a laboratory and more like a tomb. As Lazar's understanding of the technology deepened, so did the chilling realization that he was no longer an employee, but a liability. The government's grip was absolute, and he was beginning to feel the squeeze. Back in Las Vegas, the familiar silence of his home was no longer comforting, it was suspicious. He began to notice subtle clicks on his phone lines, electronic whispers that suggested he was never truly alone. Dark sedans with tinted windows became permanent fixtures on his street, silent sentinels watching his every move through the glass. Driven by a volatile mixture of scientific validation and sheer terror, Lazar decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to create witnesses. He knew the test flight schedule. Every Wednesday night, when the desert sky turned into a vast canvas of obsidian, the sport model was brought out for its ritual dance in the air. He gathered a small circle of trust, his friend Gene Huff and his wife at the time. Together they drove out into the vast, empty veins of the Nevada wilderness, armed with camcorders and a desperate need for proof. They parked on the edge of the restricted zone, overlooking the ghostly silence of Papoose Lake. Then it happened. From the heart of the mountain, a brilliant, pulsing orb of light rose into the air. It didn't flicker like a jet engine or roar like a rocket. It glowed with a rhythmic, ethereal intensity. The craft performed maneuvers that mocked the very concept of inertia. It darted at impossible angles, stopped instantaneously in midair, and vanished into the darkness only to reappear miles away in a heartbeat. "That's it," Lazar whispered, his voice trembling as the camcorder captured the grainy, glowing proof of a technology that belonged to the stars. For a fleeting moment, the fear was eclipsed by the raw majesty of the impossible. But the desert has eyes that see in the dark. On their third excursion, the darkness itself seemed to close in. High-intensity beams of light suddenly cut through the night, blinding them. Armed military personnel appeared from the sagebrush, their movements precise, mechanical, and lethal. The group was detained on the spot, their cameras seized, and the veil of secrecy was slammed shut with a violent finality. Lazar was no longer just a scientist under watch, he was a man who had crossed the red line. The next day, when he reached the gate, his security badge at S4 no longer hissed with the sound of approval. In the weeks following his detention in the desert, Bob Lazar realized that he was a dead man walking. The threats were no longer veiled, they were explicit. His security clearance had been revoked, his livelihood was gone, and he felt the immense, cold weight of the intelligence community pressing down on him. He knew that if he disappeared into the silence of the Nevada dunes, the world would never know what was hidden inside the mountain. He made a desperate, strategic calculation. The only way to stay alive was to become too famous to kill. He reached out to George Knapp, a tenacious investigative journalist at KLAS-TV in Las Vegas. Knapp was no stranger to the strange, but even he was staggered by the depth and technical precision of Lazar's testimony. In May 1989, a televised interview aired that would ripple through the decades. To protect his life, Lazar appeared as a silhouette, his face obscured by heavy backlighting and his voice electronically altered. He used the alias Dennis. In that darkened studio, Dennis spoke with a hauntingly calm demeanor. He didn't sound like a man seeking fame or a lunatic chasing phantoms. He spoke like a weary scientist burdened by an impossible truth. He detailed the 9 saucers at S4, the gravity-distorting reactor, and the existence of element 115. He described the sport model not as a magical object, but as a piece of hardware that obeyed a physics humans had yet to master. The interview was a lightning strike. Overnight, the secret facility near Groom Lake, a place the government didn't even officially acknowledge, became a household name. Area 51 was no longer just a rumor, it was a global obsession. However, the empire struck back almost immediately. As soon as Lazar's identity was eventually fully revealed, the machinery of the state began to dismantle his past. Investigators looking for his records at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, found nothing. It was as if Robert Scott Lazar had never sat in a lecture hall or earned a degree. Even his employment records at Los Alamos seemed to evaporate into thin air, leaving behind only a single newspaper clipping and a phone directory listing as the last traces of his existence there. To his critics, this was proof he was a fraud. After the 1989 broadcast, Bob Lazar did not become a hero of the people. He became a ghost in a storm. The strategy of the shadow government was not to turn him into a martyr, but to turn him into a joke. They didn't need to silence his voice if they could destroy his ears. A relentless campaign of character assassination began, a quiet warfare that aimed to erode every pillar of his credibility until only the hollow shell of a madman remained. The early 1990s were a gauntlet of public ridicule and legal entanglements. Lazar found himself in the crosshairs of the justice system, not for his breaches of national security, but for a sordid legal case involving the aiding and abetting of a prostitution ring. To the public, he was no longer the physicist who touched alien stars. He was a common criminal with an eccentric hobby. The media, once curious, now turned predatory. Every inconsistency in his past was magnified, and every credential he claimed was treated as a symptom of a pathological liar. He retreated. He moved into the shadows of Michigan and later returned to the Nevada desert, but not as an insider. He opened a scientific supply company, United Nuclear, selling chemicals and lab equipment, the mundane tools of the trade he still loved. He tried to build a life of routine, of measuring powders and shipping glass beakers, but the secret followed him like a scent. His home was never truly private. His wife, Joy, lived in a constant state of alert. The clicks on the phone lines never stopped. Black SUVs remained parked at the edge of his vision, stationary predators waiting for him to slip. Every time a helicopter flew too low over their house or the power flickered without a storm, the fear returned. Lazar once noted with a chilling sincerity that the government didn't need to take his life, they had already taken his peace. For nearly 3 decades, Lazar became a hermit of the UFO world. He declined the circuit of conventions and the lucrative book deals. He refused to perform for the cameras. This silence, perhaps more than his words, began to change the perception of him. For decades, Bob Lazar remained a curiosity of the pre-internet age, a VHS-era legend that most assumed would fade into the background radiation of history. But as the 21st century progressed, the world changed in ways that Lazar had predicted back in that smoke-filled studio in 1989. The technology he described, propulsion without visible means, instant acceleration and transmedium travel, was no longer just his story. It was being captured on the sophisticated radar systems and infrared cameras of the United States Navy. In 2018, the silence around Lazar was shattered by the filmmaker Jeremy Corbell. Corbell's documentary Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, was not just a retelling of the events. It was a psychological portrait of a man weary of his own legacy. For the first time in years, the world saw Lazar not as a silhouette, but as an aging scientist sitting in his lab, surrounded by the beakers and chemicals of United Nuclear. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent 30 years carrying a mountain on his back. The documentary introduced Lazar to a new generation, a generation that lived in a world where the Pentagon was starting to release its own UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, videos. Suddenly, Lazar's technical descriptions of how the sport model tilted and moved belly first aligned eerily with the gimbal and tic-tac sightings reported by modern fighter pilots. The crazy ideas of 1989 were beginning to look like the cutting-edge intelligence of 2020. Lazar's reappearance on massive global platforms, like the Joe Rogan Experience, acted as a second ignition point. Millions listened as he spoke with the same consistent detail he had used 30 years prior. He didn't waver. He didn't add sensational new claims. He simply sat there, often suffering from a migraine triggered by the stress of remembering, and repeated his truth. However, the shadow of the state still loomed. During the filming of the documentary, Lazar's business, United Nuclear, was raided by the FBI. Officially, it was an investigation into a chemical sale. To understand Bob Lazar's burden, one must look beyond the metallic skin of the sport model and into the heart of the reactor. In 1989, when Lazar first spoke of element 115, it was a ghost on the periodic table, a theoretical placeholder in a region scientists called the Island of Stability. He described it as a heavy, stable isotope that acted as the fuel for a civilization capable of bending the stars. The scientific community's response was a wall of cold, academic steel. They argued that such an element, if it could even exist, would be so unstable that it would vanish in a fraction of a second. But in 2003, nearly 15 years after Lazar's revelation, researchers in Russia and the United States finally synthesized element 115, naming it Moscovium. While the synthesized version was indeed unstable, Lazar remained unmoved. He insisted that the version he handled at S4 was a stable isotope, perhaps native to a star system far older and more element-rich than our own. For Lazar, the discovery of the element was not a surprise. It was a belated confirmation of a reality he had already lived, the bending of the void. The most haunting part of Lazar's testimony was not the existence of the element, but how it was used. He described the craft's propulsion as a gravity-amplified fall. The reactor didn't push the ship forward, it distorted the space-time fabric in front of it. Lazar often used a humble metaphor to describe the immense gap between human science and this alien technology. It was like giving a high-performance motorcycle to a blacksmith from the 1800s. The blacksmith would recognize the metal and the wheels, but the internal combustion engine would be a miracle beyond his vocabulary. At S4, Lazar was that blacksmith. He could see the waveguides, he could measure the gravitational output, but the why and how remained tantalizingly out of reach. This created a sense of technological mourning. Lazar realized that humanity was sitting on the solution to every energy and environmental crisis. A power source. For 30 years, Bob Lazar's sketches of the sport model existed only in the fringe corners of the internet, hand-drawn diagrams of a smooth, seamless saucer that seemed to mock the laws of aerodynamics. He had always insisted on a very specific detail. When the craft was in high-speed transit, it didn't fly nose first. It would tilt on its axis, pointing its belly and its gravity amplifiers directly at its destination. To the casual observer, it looked as if the ship was falling sideways through the sky. In the late 2010s, the world finally saw what Lazar had been describing. When the Pentagon officially declassified the now infamous gimbal video, captured by Navy pilots off the coast of Florida, the collective breath of the UFO community hitched. There in grainy infrared was a craft moving at impossible speeds. As the pilots watched in disbelief, the object suddenly rotated, tilting its base toward its path of travel, just as Lazar had diagrammed in a Las Vegas studio 3 decades earlier. This was not a vague similarity, it was a geometric match. For Lazar, watching these videos from his quiet home, there was no jubilation, only a cold, hollow sense of validation. He had spent half his life being called a charlatan for describing exactly what the world's most advanced sensor systems were now confirming. The tic-tac shapes reported by Commander David Fravor mirrored the minimalist, rivetless aesthetic Lazar had touched in the hangars of S4. The silent, instantaneous acceleration that left veteran pilots stammering was the exact signature of the gravity distortion he had tried to explain through the physics of element 115. The persistence of memory. Despite this sudden surge of credibility, Lazar remained anchored in his own reality. In his shop at United Nuclear, he still kept the old notebooks. He would occasionally look at his drawings of the internal layout, the 3-tiered seating, the central waveguide, the reactor housing. He remembered the specific shade of blue the air would turn when the reactor was at full power, a glow caused by the intense ionization of the atmosphere. He recalled the briefing documents he was given, which claimed the visitors came from the Zeta Reticuli system. At the time, skeptics laughed at the mention of a specific star system. Yet, as astronomers began discovering thousands of exoplanets in the Goldilocks zones of distant stars, the idea that someone had traveled 39 light-years to visit a desert in Nevada seemed less like. As the twilight of his life approached, Bob Lazar found himself living in the strange, liminal space between being a man and becoming a myth. He was still very much alive, still operating his scientific supply shop, and still carrying a story too jagged for comfort, yet too consistent to discard. He lived in a modest home with his wife, surrounded by the quiet, unhurried landscape of his later years, the residence of a man who never asked for the storm that had circled him for decades. Inside his world, among the ordinary furniture and the cluttered workbenches of a lifelong tinkerer, were the relics of a stolen past. There were worn books on particle physics, notebooks filled with diagrams that only a handful of people in the world would truly recognize, and the lingering scent of ozone and chemicals. He would occasionally leaf through these papers, not with the nostalgia of a man dwelling on former glories, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist trying to solve a puzzle that the world had forbidden him from finishing. The anatomy of truth. Lazar's transformation was most visible in his eyes. The wide-eyed, frantic energy of the 1989 whistleblower had been replaced by a deep, weary stillness. He no longer phrased his accounts in terms of belief. When visitors or journalists asked if he still believed what he saw at S4, his answer was always the same. It's not about belief, it's about memory. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. There was a profound, scientific mourning in his voice, a sadness not for himself, but for a lost future. He knew that the technology he had touched in that desert hangar could have ended the global energy crisis in a single afternoon. He had glimpsed a world without fossil fuels, without the poisoning of the atmosphere, and without the primitive constraints of chemical rockets. Yet he was forced to watch as humanity continued to crawl through the mud, while the keys to the stars remained locked in a mountain, guarded by a shadow empire. He didn't build a temple to his experience. He didn't form a cult or ask for followers. He simply remained consistent. This consistency, rare in an era of fleeting trends and digital noise, became his quiet badge of honor. He was the man who never changed his story, even when the world tried to break him. In his shop, he continued to measure powders and restock it. In the quiet, encroaching years of his later life, Bob Lazar became more than a whistleblower. He became a symbol of a fixed point in a shifting reality. For the UFO community and for history itself, he acted as a compass, not necessarily pointing to the answers, but pointing to the right questions. His narrative suggested that if even a fraction of his testimony were true, humanity had already made its greatest discovery and subsequently committed its greatest act of ignorance by burying it. Toward the end of his public journey, Lazar rarely spoke of S4 unless prompted by the sincere curiosity of others. It wasn't fear that kept him quiet anymore, it was a form of reverence. There was a weight to the knowledge he carried, a quiet beauty that remained untarnished by the years of ridicule. He often remarked that the hardest part of his experience was not the public disbelief, but the internal ache of knowing. He had seen a fire that could light the world, and he had to watch as the world chose to shiver in the dark, the echo of a choice. During a rare, intimate conversation with a journalist, Lazar was asked the ultimate question. If you could go back to 1989, knowing the harassment, the loss of your past, and the weight of the surveillance, would you still speak out? Lazar paused, a long, thoughtful silence stretching between the present and the desert of his youth. Finally he nodded. Yes, he said, his voice slow and steady. Because the story is bigger than I am, truth doesn't belong to the person who finds it, it belongs to everyone. His final public messages were never about aliens or space travel in the way the movies depicted them. They were about the discipline of the mind. Don't stop asking questions, he would tell the hushed audiences at small science symposiums. And never assume that the truth is what you are told it is. Sometimes, the most profound realities are the ones hidden in the silence between the words. Lazar chose stillness over noise. He didn't seek to prove his truth with shouting. He allowed the truth to endure simply by being told once and then never being changed. In a world driven by Bob Lazar's story never truly ended. It simply diffused into the collective subconscious of humanity, like a half-remembered dream that lingers in the cool stillness of dawn. Whether one accepts every syllable of his testimony or views it as a reflection of our profound yearning for the stars, his words have carved an indelible space in the dialogue of our origin. He was a man who, for a brief moment in time, claimed to have held the keys to the kingdom of the impossible. Years have passed, governments have turned over, and classified documents have slowly bled into the light. Modern fighter pilots now report encounters with the same anomalous physics Lazar described decades ago, and the stigma that once smothered the topic of UFOs has begun to evaporate. Each time the world returns to the question of what lies beyond our atmosphere, Lazar's name reemerges, not as a shout but as a persistent whisper. He told us long ago, in a world that wasn't yet ready to listen. The eternal desert. The Nevada desert remains quiet. The wind still sighs across the cracked earth of Groom Lake, and the Papoose Mountains still guard their shadows. The facility known as S4, if it ever truly existed, remains sealed behind layers of sand, iron, and institutional silence. But Lazar's legacy is not buried there. It is airborne. It lives in the curiosity of every new generation that looks at the night sky and wonders if the laws of physics are as rigid as we are told. Lazar was never a prophet, nor was he a martyr. He was a mirror, a reflection of our deepest desire to know the unknown, to pull back the heavy curtain of secrecy and glimpse the engine of the universe. He showed us that the line between the ordinary and the impossible is thinner than we dare to admit, and even for those who walk away unconvinced, that sliver of doubt, that what if, never truly leaves them. As you look up at the stars tonight, let the mystery settle around you. The story of the man